Hello there. This video is going to give you a really quick overview of what a population and sample are, how they're different, how they're related, and how that relationship between populations and samples affects external validity of research results. So just as a quick summary of what we're going to cover in this video, you can see we'll start by looking at the difference between populations and samples and how they're related, then external validity and samples, and then tying it back to the hourglass of research that starts broad, gets narrow, and then the conclusions are broad again. Most social sciences and behavioral sciences research is really designed to apply to a large-scale population that's often impossible to have access to in its entirety. So for example, like service employees or first-generation college students or people suffering from medication-resistant depression, right? All of those groups of interest, those populations, are large and difficult to have access to. Also, many experimental interventions, observational studies, and interview-focused studies are time and resource intensive and would really not be feasible to conduct with everyone the researcher wanted to apply their findings to in the population, even if they did have access to everyone. So researchers conduct experiments and collect data from a sample. The sample is really a proxy for the population and hopefully represents the individual differences and demographics in the population. As you will see soon, different sampling strategies lend themselves to varying levels of confidence in how well the sample represents the population they were drawn from. So see the next video to understand more about sampling strategies. But we'll get there. So when it comes to evaluating the merits of a particular study, the sample and the population are most relevant to the external validity or the generalizability of the results. So external validity or generalization is how well the sample represents the population, which really tells us how confident we can be that what was observed in the sample, those who participated in the research, would be observed in the population, everyone the researcher wants to make conclusions about and who the sample was supposed to represent. So external validity depends on a few things. So one is how large and dispersed the population is, and if you're able to draw a sample from the population. So making sure that ideally everyone in the population of interest has a chance to be selected for the sample that's actually in the study. Smaller populations with easy access make it much easier to get a representative sample. As I mentioned earlier, that's not usually the case in social sciences and behavioral sciences research. External validity also depends on the sample size. So a larger sample has a lower standard error for numeric variables and is more has a better representation of the population. So again, we can have more confidence that the results that we observed in the sample would also have been observed in the population if you had access to them when you have that larger, more representative sample. Another factor that dictates the external validity of research is the sampling strategy. So if you're using a random or probability sample, that tends to better represent the population than a convenience sample. But convenience or non-probability samples are more common. And you can see the next two videos for more about various sampling strategies and the pros and cons of each. So let's take a look at an example. So let's say that you have a population of professors at a university, and you're looking at the generation of those different professors. And let's say that you're going to do research on teaching strategies, and you want to make sure that your sample represents the various generations that are in the population because you think maybe teaching strategies would be affected by, age or generation. So if you look at our population here, you see that we have mostly Gen Xers, followed by baby boomers, then some millennials, and we only had 2 Gen Z professors in the population. So here's a random sample of 10 randomly selected professors from this population. And I actually did this with real data, and I used a random number generator in Excel to get this sample of 10. What you can see here is that in this sample of 10, we have an overrepresentation of baby boomers and an underrepresentation of Gen X. Also, think about how well one millennial professor represents all 30 millennial professors at the university. In this sample, we only have 3.3% of the population of millennial professors provided here. Now take a look at this sample of 100 randomly selected from this population, and I use the same random number generator in Excel. Here you can see the same pattern of representation in the population, with more Gen X professors, followed by the number of baby boomer professors and millennials. Now there are 5 millennial professors in the sample, which is 17% representation of the population. But notice that neither one of these samples captured those 2 Gen X professors or Gen Z professors that were in the population. But please notice that even with random number generators, random samples, you're going to get a more representative sample when it's a larger sample, as a rule overall. That's how it usually happens, but not always. So here's a real-world example from the Organizational Climate Survey that I conducted at Nevada State for several years, but this was the most recent report. Notice the 3 numeric columns for each demographic group that we captured in the survey. So the sample size, that first column that you see in both of these tables, so that tells you how many people from each group took the survey. Then you see the percentage of the sample, that second column here. I'm trying to highlight it, but it's not looking so good. So the percentage of the sample is the number of people in the group who took the survey divided by the sample size of 227. So that just tells you what percent of the sample had people from that group. Then that final column, the percentage of the population, that's your true response rate. And that tells you how well did the sample represent the population of all employees within each group. So when we looked at that, we were taking the number of people in the sample and dividing it by the total number of people in that group and the population of the whole entire university. So be careful when looking at the methods section of a journal article and make sure that you distinguish between the percent representation within the sample, which gives you an idea of who was in the study, and the percent representation of the population, which really tells you about the external validity of the sample. And it's actually rare because we're not always sure how many people are in the population of interest, unless you're working with a specific organization or institution like I did here. In this example, I had access to the population, all faculty, staff, and executive leadership at Nevada State, but I relied on volunteers. So, you can imagine that I didn't get everybody. I did intense recruitment with full-time employees, and as you can see here, there was a 78% participation among full-time employees. And I was a faculty member at the time, and so I really recruited from faculty quite a bit, and you can see here that I got 93% participation among all full-time faculty. So even though only like half of only 23.79% of the sample was full-time faculty, we captured almost every full-time faculty at the college. So with the full-time faculty and even the full-time employees in general, I was really confident that my survey results represented how full-time employees think about, feel about, and experience their work at Nevada State because I got such a great representative sample. As you'll notice in the part-time employee department, we didn't do as well. So many of the part-time employees were part-time faculty who didn't typically live near campus. So we went to offices to recruit in person and they weren't there to be recruited. And they also weren't as actively engaged in the campus happenings or email, which we also used for recruitment. So getting them to participate was a challenge. And you can see that we only had a 30% response rate for our part-time faculty, part-time employees over here. And so my confidence in the findings for them was lower. But honestly, our sample was probably an accurate reflection of how the most engaged part-time faculty and staff felt about Nevada State, so those results were helpful as well. But you can see how the response rate really helps you understand how representative your sample is of the population and whether or not it has a high level of external validity and generalizability. When you look at just the percentage of the sample, it tells you what the sample looks like, but you don't necessarily know about that external validity unless you can compare it to the population that they were drawn from. So I'm going to end this video by tying populations and samples to the hourglass of research that you've seen before in this class. So remember, with research, you start kind of broad, right? You have an observation, an overall question about the population, everybody that you're interested in. Then through literature reviews and finding measures, you narrow down, you focus, you operationalize your constructs, and you learn how you figure out how you're going to measure and manipulate things. Then you actually observe and collect data from your sample. And then you analyze that data and you make conclusions that then go back out to the population. So we start by being interested in the population. Then we actually investigate our hypotheses within a sample, and then hopefully we can generalize those findings out to the population at large. So I hope that this video helped give you a really good understanding of samples versus populations and how you need to think about representativeness of the sample of the population when you're looking at your own research and also the research of others. So make sure you're going to that method section and you're looking to see who the researchers actually studied so that you can determine how confident you are that the findings would apply to the population that you're interested in as well.